The morning of July 15, 1715, finds Captain William Clark standing on the deck of his stolen frigate, watching his crew slowly die. One might reasonably expect more dramatic circumstances for the birth of a technology that would reshape global naval power. But history has always preferred irony to theatricality. For 23 days, his ship has sat motionless in the glassy waters 30 miles north of Nassau, trapped in the infamous Sargasso Sea, where the seaweed grows so thick that men swear it can stop a ship dead. The men are not, it should be noted, exaggerating. Below deck, 200 pirates from every corner of the earth lie in various stages of despair. There are escaped Barbados slaves who know the Caribbean's moods better than any European navigator. Irish political prisoners who chose piracy over chains, which says something rather pointed about British prison conditions. Mosquito Indians who joined after Spanish raids destroyed their villages, bringing with them an entirely justified hostility toward colonial powers. The water barrels ran dry 3 days ago, and men now drink their own urine mixed with seawater, a cocktail that drives them mad before it kills them. The human body, as it turns out, was not designed with becalming in mind. Clark runs his hands along the hull at the waterline, feeling the thick beard of barnacles, each one the size of a child's fist, that transforms his once swift frigate into a floating garden. The fouling is so severe that when the ghost of a breeze finally stirs, the ship barely moves, like trying to drag a house through mud. His fingers find the teredo wormholes, dozens of them, where the shipworms have begun their patient work of turning his vessel into a sieve. These creatures, it must be said, show considerably more dedication to their craft than most human workers. In another month, if they survive that long, the ship will simply break apart and sink. Nature has little regard for human schedules. The copper sheets in his hold mock him with their uselessness. 3,000 pounds of gleaming metal stripped from a Spanish merchantman 2 months ago, worth £2,250 sterling. A fortune sufficient to retire 20 men to comfortable lives ashore, which makes it rather unfortunate that copper's only known applications involve roofing, coinage, and decorative purposes, none of which prove particularly useful at sea. His men argue about dividing it, not knowing they are arguing over their own funeral shrouds. The irony would be delicious if it were not quite so fatal. But Clark remembers something from his previous life as a Bristol shipwright's apprentice, back when his criminal record consisted of nothing more serious than occasional public drunkenness. He recalls how the copper nails in certain parts of ships seemed to repel the growth that everywhere else ran rampant. The observation had struck him as curious at the time, in that vague way that most useful discoveries begin, as barely noticed peculiarities that someone later claims they always knew were important. When the British Navy sails appear on the horizon, 3 frigates that will reach them by tomorrow's noon if any wind comes, Clark makes his desperate proposition. One imagines the conversation went over rather well, given that the alternative was hanging. His quartermaster, a former chemistry student from Edinburgh turned pirate after killing his professor in a duel over some now forgotten academic dispute, understands immediately. The specifics of the chemical reaction involved would not be properly understood for another century. But then again, most of human progress consists of doing things that work before understanding why. The Africans who learned diving in their homeland's pearl beds volunteer to work underwater, knowing that Caribbean sharks circle becalmed ships waiting for bodies. The knowledge that one is essentially offering oneself as bait does concentrate the mind wonderfully. The Welsh miners in the crew know how to hammer metal in confined spaces without splitting the wood beneath, skills acquired in environments that make piracy seem almost sensible by comparison. When desperate criminals possess exactly the skills needed for an unprecedented maritime innovation, one must conclude that God has either an excellent sense of humour or no involvement whatsoever. For 3 days they work, diving in shifts, fighting off sharks with boarding pikes while hammering copper sheets against the hull. They use their precious remaining tar to create a barrier between copper and iron bolts. Clark remembers that detail from Bristol, how copper touching iron creates a battery that eats through both metals. This particular bit of electrochemistry, discovered accidentally by pirates and rediscovered formally by scientists decades later, suggests something rather unflattering about the pace of academic research. 7 men die in those 3 days. 2 from sharks, which at least had the decency to kill quickly. 3 from drowning when they stay under too long, driven by desperation past the point of sense. 2 from exhaustion, their hearts simply giving up after bodies pushed beyond reasonable limits. Their bodies go over the side without ceremony because there is no time for the luxury of proper funerals. The living have their own survival to attend to, and the dead are past caring about ritual. But when the morning of the 4th day brings the faintest breath of wind, Clark's copper-clad vessel begins to move. The barnacles have fallen away like scales, unable to grip the toxic metal. His ship slides forward at 4 knots while the Navy frigates, their fouled bottoms creating terrible drag, barely manage one. The British captains, one imagines, spend considerable time reviewing their charts and checking their sails, unable to comprehend how a pirate vessel dead in the water 3 days prior now outpaces His Majesty's finest frigates. Clark and his crew escape to the Carolina coast, where they beach the ship and quietly disappear into the colonial frontier. The copper sheets remain, gleaming dully in the southern sun, a monument to the fact that history's pivotal innovations frequently emerge not from careful research, but from desperation, criminal ingenuity, and the happy accident of having exactly the wrong people in exactly the right place. The British Navy, having failed to capture Clark, has no idea they have just witnessed the future of naval warfare sail past them at speeds their finest ships cannot match. One might expect Clark to capitalize on his discovery, perhaps selling it to the highest bidder or establishing himself as a maritime consultant. Instead, he vanishes into history, leaving barely a trace beyond some disputed records in Charleston. The secret of copper sheathing, meanwhile, begins its journey through the underworld of Caribbean piracy, where information spreads through networks that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. Within months, every pirate captain from the Carolinas to Venezuela will be hunting for Clark's secret, willing to kill for the knowledge that a dying thief stumbled upon while trying to avoid hanging. History, it seems, cares little for who deserves credit, only for what actually works. The escape of Clark's copper-bottomed ship sends shockwaves through the Caribbean's pirate republic, where information travels faster than ships through the networks of tavern keepers, prostitutes, and corrupt port officials who serve all flags equally. These individuals, existing in the margins of legitimate society, prove far more efficient at intelligence gathering than any government agency of the period. One suspects this has something to do with their motivation being actual survival rather than bureaucratic advancement. Within weeks, every pirate captain from the Carolinas to Venezuela hunts for Clark's secret with the sort of focused intensity normally reserved for treasure maps and revenge. The questions circulate through every den of iniquity between Havana and Barbados. How thick must the copper be? What holds it to the hull? Why do some ships with copper nails still foul, while Clark's vessel remained clean? The pirate community, it turns out, can be remarkably scientific when their lives depend on the answers. The answer comes through blood and betrayal when Black Sam Bellamy captures Clark's quartermaster off Cape Cod in 1716. Bellamy, whose reputation for relative mercy made him popular among pirates and terrifying to merchants who could never predict his moods, proves considerably less merciful when strategic advantage hangs in the balance. Under torture that involves copper coins, heated red-hot and pressed against skin, a cruel irony that one imagines Bellamy rather enjoyed, the quartermaster reveals not just the technique, but the crucial details that separate success from expensive failure. Baltic copper works best, being purer than Spanish. The tar barrier must be complete, or the ship's iron will dissolve in a chemical reaction that leaves one with neither copper protection nor structural integrity. The sheets must overlap like dragon scales, or the protection fails, allowing growth in the gaps that defeats the entire purpose. These specifics, extracted through methods that would make modern interrogators uncomfortable, represent the difference between maritime dominance and an expensive disaster. Bellamy guards this knowledge jealously, sharing it only with his most trusted crew members and threatening death to anyone who speaks of it ashore. His caution proves entirely sensible and completely futile. His death in a storm 8 months later scatters his crew and their secret across the Atlantic world, like seeds from a burst pod. One rather suspects Bellamy would have preferred a more controlled dissemination, but history rarely consults the preferences of the dead. One survivor, a Welsh carpenter named Thomas Davis, sells the information to Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, for passage to Madagascar. Davis, having survived Bellamy's final storm only to find himself stranded in Boston, demonstrates the sort of practical ethics common among pirates. Loyalty lasts exactly as long as circumstances permit. Blackbeard pays for the information with Spanish gold and a solemn promise not to kill Davis, a promise he keeps largely because dead men make poor sailing companions. Blackbeard becomes obsessed with perfecting the technique, conducting experiments on captured vessels with the methodical approach of a natural philosopher. If natural philosophers typically performed their research on stolen property while heavily armed, he discovers that copper-sheathed ships remain remarkably stable in hurricanes, the metal sheets acting like flexible armor that prevents waves from working into the seams between planks. This discovery comes at the cost of several captured sloops and their crews, who serve as involuntary research subjects in experiments that would never receive modern ethical approval. His flagship Queen Anne's Revenge, fully coppered using sheets stolen from a Brazilian-Portuguese merchantman, dances through a storm off the Outer Banks that sinks two pursuing Navy sloops. The British captains go to their deaths, presumably wondering what sort of devil's bargain Blackbeard had made. The answer, as it happens, involves metallurgy rather than Satan, though from their perspective the distinction hardly mattered. The secret spreads through pirate culture in fascinating ways that demonstrate how criminals, when properly motivated, create information networks of remarkable sophistication. Pirates encode the coppering instructions in sea shanties, with specific verses describing the overlap pattern, the tar mixture, and the hammering rhythm that prevents splitting. Future musicologists, unaware they are transcribing technical specifications, will preserve these songs as examples of maritime folk culture. One imagines the pirates would appreciate the irony. Anne Bonny allegedly hides detailed diagrams in her corset lining when captured, though the authorities never think to search there. Whether this story is true or merely represents wishful thinking by later romantics, it speaks to the era's assumptions about where women might hide contraband. The authorities' failure to conduct thorough searches of female prisoners would prove a recurring theme in criminal history, suggesting that chivalry's main beneficiaries were often those it was meant to protect from. Mary Read teaches the technique to the community of escaped slaves at Maroon Town in Jamaica, where it becomes part of their maritime resistance against colonial powers. The Maroons, already sophisticated in their understanding of guerrilla warfare, incorporate copper sheathing into their coastal raiding vessels. The Spanish and British authorities, fighting an endless war against Maroon independence, find themselves consistently outmaneuvered by vessels they cannot catch. Military reports from the period attribute this to superior seamanship, never imagining that escaped slaves might possess metallurgical knowledge that the Royal Navy lacks. Pirates develop elaborate rituals around coppering ceremonies that blend African traditions of metalworking magic with European superstitions and Native American purification rites. Anthropologists would later struggle to classify these hybrid ceremonies, which involve elements borrowed from at least 3 continents and modified according to strictly practical considerations. When the copper sheets go on, crews burn sage, pour rum into the sea, and hammer to rhythms that supposedly please ocean spirits. Whether the spirits appreciate the gesture is unknowable, but the copper certainly works regardless. The intelligence war intensifies as naval powers recognize that pirates with copper-bottomed ships capture 40% more prizes and lose 60% fewer vessels to weather. These statistics, compiled by insurance companies with admirable disregard for the criminality involved, make the strategic implications impossible to ignore. A technological advantage that's significant cannot be allowed to remain in criminal hands, particularly when those hands are actively using it to strangle maritime commerce. The British Admiralty offers £10,000 sterling for the complete secret, more than most pirates see in a lifetime of crime. The sum represents roughly 400 years of wages for a common seaman, which gives some indication of how desperately the Admiralty wants this information. Pirates, who normally cannot resist the lure of ready cash, prove remarkably tight-lipped. One suspects this has less to do with honor than with the knowledge that the first pirate to claim the reward would likely be the last pirate to reach shore alive. Spanish agents infiltrate pirate crews, often dying horribly when discovered. The Spanish approach to intelligence gathering, which favors Baroque cruelty over efficiency, ensures that their agents are both easy to spot and serve as effective warnings to others. Pirates leave bodies in positions that make the cause of death and the nature of betrayal unmistakably clear. The Spanish persist regardless, demonstrating the sort of institutional stubbornness that characterized their empire's long decline. The French send a trained engineer disguised as a common sailor to Nassau, but pirates detect his soft hands and educated speech within days. The engineer, whose preparation apparently did not include actually learning to do manual labor, stands out among genuine sailors like a dancing master at a dockworker's tavern. He is found floating in the harbour, copper nails driven through his palms in a gesture that manages to be both symbolic and practical. The nails, one notes, are not recovered for reuse. By 1760, the secret has become impossible to contain. Too many shipwrights have seen coppered pirate vessels in dry dock. Too many captured pirates have traded information for their lives. Too many drunken sailors have bragged in too many taverns. The secret's protection relied on a conspiracy of silence among criminals, which is to say, it relied on nothing at all. Pirates, whatever their other virtues, are not known for discretion after the third rum. The final revelation comes from Thomas Bowery, facing the gallows at Newgate Prison in London. Bowery, whose career included service with Blackbeard, Black Bart Roberts, and Calico Jack Rackham, possesses more comprehensive knowledge than any other surviving pirate. He negotiates brilliantly, demonstrating skills that might have served him well in legitimate commerce had he chosen that considerably duller path. Not just a pardon but £5,000 and passage to Virginia in exchange for every detail. His 3-day testimony to the Admiralty includes the specific copper thickness of 1/16 of an inch, the optimal nail spacing of 4 inches, and most crucially, the discovery that adding zinc to copper creates brass, which protects even better. This last detail, discovered by some anonymous pirate experimenting with mixed metals, represents a genuine metallurgical advance that will not be formally explained by chemistry for decades. Bowery's betrayal ends the pirates' monopoly but begins a new chapter in naval warfare. The Admiralty thanks him with cold efficiency, pays him promptly, and ships him to Virginia as promised. Bowery lives another 20 years in modest comfort, forever watching the horizon for pirates who never come. One imagines his nights were not entirely peaceful, but then again, peaceful nights are not generally available to men who betray entire communities for gold. He dies in his bed, which is more than most pirates manage, but his name becomes synonymous with treachery in songs sung from Madagascar to the Carolinas. History remembers him, which is what he wanted, though perhaps not quite in the manner he hoped. The British Admiralty's decision to copper HMS Alarm in 1761 represents one of history's most consequential military investments, though at the time it appears to be merely an expensive gamble based on information extracted from a criminal. The initial cost of £20,000 sterling causes Parliament to balk with the sort of fiscal horror normally reserved for discussing royal mistresses' allowances. £20,000 could build an entire frigate from scratch, or feed several regiments for a year, or purchase sufficient rum to render the entire Channel Fleet insensible for a month. Spending it on metal sheets to nail to a single ship's bottom strikes many members of Parliament as precisely the sort of naval excess that requires immediate investigation. First Lord of the Admiralty George Anson presents his calculation with the patience of a man explaining basic arithmetic to particularly slow children. 1 coppered ship equals 1.3 conventional vessels in combat effectiveness. The mathematics involve speed, endurance, maintenance cycles, and operational availability, none of which particularly interest politicians who prefer their naval strategy expressed in terms of guns and glory. Anson persists, because Anson has actually sailed on fouled ships and understands what Parliament does not. That the fastest gun in the world means nothing if one cannot bring it within range of the enemy. The coppering process itself becomes a spectacle at Portsmouth, With thousands gathering to watch workers apply 17 tons of copper in sheets so thin, you can bend them with your hands yet strong enough to withstand ocean storms. The copper arrives from Anglesey mines in Wales, rolled at specialised mills in Bristol, cut to precise dimensions by craftsmen who suddenly find their previously modest trade has become strategically vital. The workers hammer for 6 weeks, applying 4,300 sheets in the overlapping dragon-scale pattern that pirates died to protect. One imagines some elderly pirate, watching from the crowd in anonymous retirement, experiencing complicated emotions. HMS Alarm's first voyage stuns everyone, including the officers who advocated for the experiment. She maintains 7 knots in winds that leave conventional frigates struggling to make 3. Her captain reports that she handles storms off Biscay that would normally require constant pumping without taking a cup of water. The copper's smooth surface creates laminar flow that conventional hulls cannot match, a hydrodynamic principle that will not be formally understood for another century, but which works perfectly well in ignorance of theoretical physics. Within 6 months, she captures 4 French merchantmen that could not outrun her even with a head start. The French captains protest that the Alarm must be carrying illegal extra sails or employing some new rigging configuration. When informed that their pursuer's advantage lies in her copper bottom, their responses are not recorded, but one suspects involved considerable profanity. The French Navy, observing from afar, initially dismisses the reports as British propaganda of the usual implausible variety. French spies confirm the terrible truth by 1762. Their reports to Versailles describe the copper sheathing in technical detail, including costs that make French naval administrators blanch. France, engaged in expensive continental wars and maintaining a court whose extravagance makes the British monarchy look positively austere, cannot afford to copper its fleet. The decision not to pursue copper technology immediately will prove catastrophically expensive in the long run, but immediate budgets always trump long-term strategy in government accounting. The 7 Years' War becomes the proving ground for copper's strategic value in ways that confirm Anson's mathematics and exceed his predictions. British coppered frigates maintain blockades through winter storms that previously would have forced them to port. Ships that once required careening every 4 months now sail for 18 months without maintenance, multiplying effective fleet strength without building a single additional vessel. The Admiralty's accountants, discovering that their expensive gamble has somehow reduced costs, experience the sort of pleasant confusion that rarely visits government budgets. At Quiberon Bay in 1759, Admiral Hawke's partially coppered fleet manages to maintain formation in a gale that scatters the French, leading to decisive victory. The battle becomes a textbook example of how technological advantage compounds tactical skill. Hawke's aggressive pursuit into dangerous waters succeeds because his coppered ships respond predictably in conditions that leave French vessels wallowing. The French, fighting both weather and technology, never stood a reasonable chance. British historians will later celebrate Hawke's boldness, while conveniently downplaying the fact that his ships could do things French vessels physically could not. The economic warfare proves equally devastating. British privateers with coppered hulls capture French merchant ships at unprecedented rates, strangling French colonial trade. Insurance rates for French shipping quadruple between 1760 and 1763. French merchants begin routing cargo through neutral vessels at considerable expense, or simply declining to ship at all. The economic damage exceeds anything achieved by conventional naval action, demonstrating that the fastest way to win a war is often to make it economically impossible for the enemy to continue fighting. The American Revolution showcases copper's multiplier effect in global strategy with stark clarity. Britain's 60 coppered warships effectively perform like 78 conventional ones, allowing them to maintain simultaneous blockades of American ports while protecting Caribbean sugar islands and fighting the French in Indian waters. This strategic flexibility, achieved through metallurgy rather than magic, lets Britain punch well above its actual weight in ships and men. The rebels' inability to copper their ships proves a critical disadvantage that American histories later gloss over in favor of more inspiring narratives about courage and determination. The Continental Navy's lack of copper technology stems not from ignorance, but from lack of copper supplies, manufacturing capacity, and the specialized craftsmen needed for proper application. Britain controls most copper mines, the rebels lack industrial infrastructure, and British blockades prevent importing either raw materials or finished products. American privateers find themselves repeatedly outrun by copper-bottomed British frigates, even when wind and position favor them, leading to captures that courage cannot prevent. France enters the war on America's side in 1778, but French ships still lack comprehensive copper sheathing due to cost and supply limitations. The French Navy's performance improves when operating in home waters with regular maintenance access, but deteriorates dramatically during extended Caribbean or American coast deployments. British ships maintain speed and handling, while French vessels gradually foul, creating advantages that British captains exploit ruthlessly. The revolution succeeds despite this technological disadvantage rather than overcoming it, relying on French numbers and British strategic overextension rather than naval parity. The copper race intensifies as nations scramble for supplies with the sort of desperation previously reserved for gold rushes. Britain secures Canadian copper mines through strategic purchases and occasional intimidation. Spain leverages its South American resources, finally putting its colonial holdings to use for something beyond silver extraction. France desperately tries to develop alternatives, investing in research programs that consistently produce interesting chemistry and useless results. The Dutch experiment with lead sheathing ends catastrophically when entire crews develop lead poisoning that manifests as madness, paralysis, and death. The symptoms appear gradually enough that officers initially attribute them to normal maritime hazards before the pattern becomes undeniable. The Dutch abandon lead sheathing after losing 3 ships to crews too poisoned to sail, providing future toxicologists with case studies and contemporary shipowners with nightmare scenarios. The Portuguese attempt with brass actually attracts more barnacles due to zinc leaching, creating surfaces rougher than conventional wood. Portuguese captains report the bewildering experience of watching their expensive brass-sheathed vessels perform worse than unprotected ships. The brass experiments cost Portugal's treasury considerable sums, while teaching European navies valuable lessons about which metals not to use, a contribution to maritime knowledge that Portugal probably did not intend to make. Russia tries iron sheets that rust within months, creating rough surfaces that slow ships worse than barnacles, while adding weight that makes vessels dangerously unstable. Russian naval reports describe ships listing unpredictably and responding sluggishly to helm, characteristics that make Atlantic crossings exciting in ways that sailors do not appreciate. The iron sheathing program is quietly abandoned after one spectacular sinking, though official reports attribute the loss to storm damage rather than catastrophically bad metallurgy. By the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, the copper advantage has become decisive in ways that make naval combat almost unfair. Every British ship in Nelson's fleet bears copper sheathing, maintained to perfection by specialized crews who understand that their nation's survival depends on keeping those hulls smooth. The maintenance regime involves inspection schedules, replacement protocols, and quality standards that would impress modern manufacturing engineers. British dockyards have transformed copper application from experimental procedure to industrial process, achieving consistency that their enemies cannot match. The French and Spanish fleets, with only partial coppering due to supply shortages and inferior application techniques, struggle to maintain speed and formation. Some ships have copper, some do not. Some copper was applied properly, some was not. The resulting fleet moves at the speed of its slowest vessels, which negates any advantage the coppered ships might provide. Napoleon's admirals understand the problem, but lack solutions beyond hoping for favorable winds and British mistakes. When the October Atlantic swell rises during the battle, British ships ride steady while enemy vessels wallow like drunken merchants. The copper sheathing's smooth surface creates stability that fouled hulls cannot match. British gun crews work from steady platforms, while French and Spanish gunners struggle with decks that pitch unpredictably. Accuracy differences that seem modest in percentage terms prove devastating in aggregate, as British broadsides hit targets while enemy fire largely misses. The complete copper coverage prevents water infiltration that would normally occur during combat damage, keeping British ships fighting even when shot through. Cannonballs that penetrate hulls normally allow seawater to pour in through gaps between planks. Copper sheathing, properly applied with overlapping scales, maintains watertight integrity even when damaged. Ships that should be sinking instead remain operational, giving British vessels effective immortality that enemies lack. The victory that ensures British naval supremacy for a century owes as much to copper as to courage, though admitting this publicly would rather spoil the narrative. Nelson's famous signal about England expecting every man to do his duty makes excellent propaganda, but the real message might have been that England expected every ship to have proper copper sheathing. The men did their duty admirably, but they did it from ships that technology made superior to anything the enemy could field. Courage matters, certainly, but it matters considerably more when combined with metallurgical advantages that pirates died to discover. The Copper Revolution reaches its zenith between 1780 and 1860, transforming not just naval warfare, but human civilization's relationship with the ocean in ways that make the original military applications seem almost quaint. The great clipper ships of the 1850s, their hulls gleaming with copper that costs more than most houses, achieve speeds that seem to defy physics and make steamship advocates question their assumptions about progress. These vessels represent the absolute pinnacle of sailing technology, the moment when wind-powered ships reached their theoretical maximum performance before steam engines rendered the entire question obsolete. The Lightning, racing from Boston to Liverpool in 1854, maintains 18 knots for 24 hours straight, a speed that steamships will not match for decades. Her captain credits the mirror-smooth copper bottom that slides through water like quicksilver, creating flow patterns that conventional hulls cannot achieve. Modern hydrodynamic analysis confirms his intuition. Properly applied copper sheathing reduces drag by 35% compared to fouled wood, a performance improvement that no amount of sail optimization can match. The captain's metaphor about quicksilver proves more technically accurate than he knew. The economic transformation proves staggering in ways that compound far beyond simple speed calculations. Ships that once required careening every 4 months now sail for 18 months without maintenance, tripling operational availability. The hidden cost of fouling, lost speed, missed tides, spoiled cargo, disappears almost overnight. Merchants discover that copper sheathing pays for itself within 2 years through reduced maintenance and increased voyage frequency, making it essentially free money for anyone with sufficient capital to afford the initial investment. The China tea trade exemplifies this revolution with the sort of dramatic clarity that economists love. Copper-clad clippers complete 3 annual voyages versus 2 for conventional ships, transforming the fundamental economics of transcontinental commerce. The first ship to reach London with the season's tea crop commands premium prices, creating a race where speed translates directly to profit. Clipper captains push their copper-bottomed vessels to extremes that would be suicidal in fouled ships, carrying maximum sail in conditions that conventional wisdom calls insane. They succeed because copper gives them margins for error that their competitors lack. The price of tea in London drops by 60% between 1770 and 1820, largely due to copper's efficiency in ways that social historians consistently attribute to other causes. Scholars write extensively about improved cultivation techniques, better trade relationships, and streamlined distribution networks, all of which matter, but none of which matter as much as the simple fact that ships now complete 3 voyages in the time they once managed 2. Tea transforms from an aristocratic luxury into a middle-class staple, because copper makes shipping cheap enough to support mass consumption. The British national identity, built partly on tea drinking, owes its existence to metallurgy that pirates discovered while trying to avoid hanging. Charles Darwin's voyage on HMS Beagle from 1831 to 1836 demonstrates copper's scientific impact in ways that biology textbooks never mention. The Beagle's copper sheathing allows her to maintain the precise schedule necessary for Darwin's observations, reaching the Galapagos Islands during the exact season needed to observe finch feeding behaviors. Without copper's protection against tropical fouling, the voyage would have taken 2 years longer, potentially changing the history of evolutionary theory by delivering Darwin's observations past the window when they could influence contemporary debates. Darwin himself never comments on the copper sheathing, taking it for granted in the way that people always ignore the technology that makes their work possible. His journals discuss winds, tides, and navigation, but never mention that his ship maintains speeds that vessels just decades earlier could not match. One imagines Darwin, focused on finches and geology, remaining blissfully unaware that pirate innovations enabled his scientific observations. The connection between criminal desperatio and evolutionary theory exists but goes unrecognized, which is probably for the best given Victorian sensibilities about scientific dignity. The California gold rush of 1849 succeeds partly because copper-bottomed ships can reliably round Cape Horn, a passage that previously claimed one ship in 5 through combination of storms, ice, and the sort of maritime conditions that make sailors religious. 20,000 fortune seekers reach San Francisco in copper-protected vessels during 1849 alone, transforming California from Spanish backwater to American state in the span of months. The gold draws them, certainly, but copper gets them there alive in sufficient numbers to matter. The social mixing aboard these ships creates California's unique multicultural foundation in ways that historians attribute to American frontier spirit, while ignoring the maritime logistics involved. European, nobility seeking adventure, American farmers seeking fortune, Chinese laborers seeking opportunity, Chilean miners seeking higher wages, all travel together on ships whose copper bottoms make the journey survivable. The enforced proximity of 18,000-mile voyages creates relationships and understandings that would never form in more segregated circumstances. California's relative tolerance, compared to other American regions, owes something to the fact that its founders spent months together on copper-clad ships, learning that survival depends on cooperation regardless of background. The abandoned copper-clad ships in San Francisco Bay, their valuable sheathing stripped for local buildings, become hotels, stores, and saloons that form the city's first permanent structures. The Niantic, a former clipper ship, serves as a hotel until 1851, when fire destroys her superstructure but leaves her copper-lined hull intact. Later construction buries her beneath what becomes downtown San Francisco, where she remains, a copper-clad time capsule waiting for archaeologists. Several other ships meet similar fates, their copper becoming roof-flashing, bar tops, and decorative elements in buildings that stand for decades. San Francisco's founding structures contain pirate-discovered technology in literal ways that city historians find endlessly amusing. The environmental and health impacts prove equally profound in ways that only become apparent through statistical analysis. Copper's natural antimicrobial properties, though not scientifically understood until the 20th century, dramatically reduce disease transmission through ship hulls. Cholera outbreaks on copper-bottomed ships occur at half the rate of conventional vessels, a correlation that doctors notice without understanding causation. They attribute it to better ventilation, cleaner conditions, or superior crew discipline, never imagining that the copper sheets are actively killing bacteria, bilge water. The faster voyages mean less scurvy, less starvation, less madness from months at sea. Every week cut from a voyage reduces mortality by approximately 2%, a grim calculation that maritime insurance companies track with actuarial precision. Copper sheathing, by maintaining speeds that fouled hulls cannot match, saves lives through simple mathematics. Maritime insurance companies calculate that copper sheathing saves 12,000 lives between 1770 and 1870, a number that represents saved premiums and also actual human beings who reach their destinations alive rather than being buried at sea. The democratization of ocean travel represents copper's most profound impact, though this occurs so gradually that contemporaries barely notice. Passenger fares drop by 40% between 1770 and 1850 as copper makes shipping more efficient. Immigration becomes affordable for classes that previously could never contemplate transcontinental relocation. The Great Migrations from Europe to America, from China to California, from India to the Caribbean, all become possible because copper makes shipping cheap enough to support mass human movement. Today, every modern anti-fouling paint, every submarine's smooth hull, Every racing yacht's polished bottom traces its lineage to William Clark's desperate gamble in ways that naval architects acknowledge but general public never considers. The principle he discovered, that the right surface treatment can dramatically improve marine performance, underlies technologies from nuclear submarines to Olympic swimming pools. Modern anti-fouling paints use copper compounds mixed with biocides, a chemical sophistication that would astonish 18th-century pirates but represents direct evolution of their discovery. The phrase copper-bottomed guarantee exists in 17 languages, meaning absolute reliability in contexts that have nothing to do with ships. The metaphor survives because people remember that copper-bottomed vessels were reliable when nothing else was, even if they have forgotten why. English speakers promise copper-bottomed guarantees on everything from business contracts to romantic commitments, invoking maritime technology they do not understand to convey trustworthiness they may not possess. Museums preserve copper-sheathed vessels as monuments to human ingenuity, though the displays rarely mention that pirates discovered the technique. HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar, sits in dry dock at Portsmouth with her copper sheathing restored to period condition. Visitors photograph the gleaming metal without understanding that they are looking at technology that criminal desperados developed while trying to avoid execution. The museum placards discuss naval engineering and British maritime supremacy, but carefully avoid mentioning that the Royal Navy's advantage began with pirate innovation. Traditional boat builders in Scotland, Japan, and Chile maintain copper working techniques as sacred cultural knowledge, passing them through generations with the sort of reverence usually reserved for religious rituals. Scottish boatwrights on the Hebrides still hammer copper sheets using patterns their great-great-grandfathers learned, creating fishing vessels that slide through North Atlantic storms with preternatural grace. Japanese shipwrights incorporate copper sheathing into traditional designs, blending Edo period aesthetics with Caribbean pirate technology in combinations that please neither purists nor modernists, but work beautifully. Chilean boat builders in Valparaiso apply copper to wooden fishing boats, using techniques that have not changed in 200 years, creating vessels that outlast fiberglass alternatives by decades. In the ultimate historical irony, the pirate who fought against empire gave empires the tool for global dominance, yet also democratized the seas, making ocean travel safer and more accessible for all humanity. Clark, trying merely to survive one more day, stumbled onto a technology that would enable British naval supremacy, American expansion, global trade integration, and mass human migration. His discovery strengthened the very imperial powers he spent his life fighting, while simultaneously making oceans more survivable for common people who would never afford passage on pre-copper vessels. History provides no evidence that Clark understood or cared about these implications. He wanted to avoid hanging and found that copper solved his immediate problem. Everything else followed from that desperate gamble through chains of causation that no one could predict, and few, even now, fully understand. The technology that reshaped global civilization emerged not from careful planning, but from a pirate's last desperate attempt to cheat the gallows, which suggests something either profound or profoundly depressing about how human progress actually works. One suspects the truth involves both.